If you are a student, maybe a researcher, or, just someone learning about anti-colonial thought, today's discussion is really essential.
Absolutely. We're diving into the work of Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, a major figure.
Right, a giant. And we're trying to understand this monumental claim he makes, that real political independence, genuine independence, it doesn't mean much unless you first dismantle the mental structures built by empire.
It's about decolonizing the mind itself. That's the core idea we're exploring, mainly through his seminal collection of essays, Decolonizing the Mind.
And Ngũgĩ really forces you to confront something quite stark, doesn't he? That language.
Yeah.
It isn't just a tool for, writing poems or ordering coffee.
No, not at all. He frames it as the critical political battleground, the very heart, you could say, of the anti-colonial struggle.
Okay, let's try and unpack that straight away, because the stakes, as he puts them, are just huge. He says the fight against imperialism has to be total.
Total, yeah. We often focus on the obvious things, right?
It's exactly. Picking out armies, getting political control, maybe nationalizing industries.
But imperialism, he argues, is much, much more pervasive. It has economic, political, military consequences, obviously, but also cultural, and this is key, psychological consequences.
And if you don't tackle that psychological dimension,
then you haven't really achieved liberation. You've just maybe changed the face of the boss. This is where he introduces this incredibly powerful, chilling concept, the cultural bomb.
the cultural bomb.
He calls it the single biggest weapon wielded by imperialism. It's not loud like a regular bomb. It's this device of silent, systematic annihilation.
So it detonates not in a city square, but inside the mind, inside the consciousness of the colonized person. What's the effect? What does it actually do?
It's devastating because it's multi-layered. It works to annihilate a people's belief in their own names, their languages, their heritage, their history, their capacity.
To self-worth.
Fundamentally, it fosters this profound level of, self-doubt, even self-hatred. The colonized are compelled, really, to identify with the foreign language and the foreign culture it carries.
And to see their own past as, what was the phrase?
As a wasteland of non-achievement, that's his term. Your own history becomes something to be ashamed of, something empty.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's like cultural genocide, but executed through the mind itself. Making people believe the cure for their supposed backwardness comes from embracing the very tools of the conqueror.
Precisely. So our mission today in this deep dive is to track this weapon language, how it became this key tool of subjugation, how it was embedded in things like the education system.
And then, crucially, the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
How writers, activists, students, ordinary people fought back, how they tried to reclaim their linguistic heritage as the path, the only path maybe, to real liberation and self-definition.
We're really looking at the intellectual and cultural architecture of self-determination, how you rebuild that sense of self after the bomb has gone off.
Okay, so to really feel the weight of this cultural bomb, we need to understand the historical machinery that planted it. For many people learning about this, the first violence of colonialism is obvious: the sword, the bullet.
Right, the physical force. But Ngũgĩ argues, quite compellingly, that the structural damage was done by something much quieter, much more insidious.
Where does he trace the roots of this division?
Well, a key moment he points to, a foundational moment for the continent's future linguistic map, was the Berlin Conference, 1884.
Right, the infamous Scramble for Africa.
Exactly. That meeting carved up Africa geographically, politically, setting future borders. But maybe even more critically, it divided the continent culturally. It essentially created these linguistic zones defined by the colonial powers.
So you end up with English-speaking Africa, French-speaking Africa, Portuguese-speaking Africa.
And so on, yeah. And these divisions, based on the colonizers' language, persisted long after independence, shaping trade, education, national identity itself.
Meaning nations continued to define themselves, in many ways, through the very language of the power that had subjugated them.
That initial physical violence of the battlefield, Ngũgĩ says, was quickly followed, and maybe even surpassed in its long-term effects, by what he calls the psychological violence of the classroom.
The chalk and the blackboard replacing the sword and bullet, in a sense.
In a very real sense. The new colonial school was absolutely crucial because it formalized the conquest. It aimed to make it permanent by capturing the mind.
Let's pause on that colonial school for a second, because the way he describes its effectiveness, it sounds almost more potent than a military occupation.
It was designed to be. Ngũgĩ references writers like Sheikh Hamidou Kane, whose novel Ambiguous Adventure really captures this. The idea is the school took the efficiency of the cannon.
but aimed it differently.
Exactly. Better than the canon, it aimed to fascinate the soul. The canon forces obedience through fear. The school aimed for internalized agreement, making the colonized want to assimilate.
Fascinating the soul by showing a supposedly superior world while simultaneously terrifying it into submission. And the main tool for that submission was linguistic control.
Pure linguistic control. Delivered through, well, humiliation. Just raw humiliation.
Can you give us some examples? He writes about his own experiences in Kenya, right?
He does. He recalls vividly how English was elevated. It became the language, and all other Kenyan languages had to bow before it in deference. If you were caught speaking Gekas, his mother tongue, or any indigenous language anywhere near the school premises.
Even in the playground.
Even in the playground, yes. The punishment was corporal, immediate, and severe, usually 3 to 5 strokes of the cane, often on the bare buttocks.
Okay, the cane is brutal, physical,
Yeah.
but you mentioned humiliation. Were there other methods designed to attack psychologically?
Oh, yes. And these are perhaps even more chilling because they aim to instill deep shame. These were the humiliation rituals.
What did they involve?
The most notorious one involved forcing a child caught speaking their mother tongue to wear a metal plate. Sometimes it was hung around the neck on a chain.
And written on the plate.
Things like, "I am stupid," or "I am a donkey." The child was literally branded, marked as deficient as an animal for using the language of their parents, their community, their identity.
Just imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
A child forced to wear that label, walking around the school, visible to everyone.
Yeah.
That's institutionalized psychological torture, isn't it?
All right.
Designed to sever that connection.
Precisely. To teach the child that their own language, the language of their culture, is a source of shame, ridicule, and failure. And it gets even darker.
Wow, so?
Because the system wasn't just about punishing individuals. It was designed to sow division, to teach betrayal within the community of children. Ngũgĩ describes the infamous button system.
The button system. How did that work?
A teacher would give one pupil a button at the start of the day. If that pupil heard another student speaking the mother tongue, they had to pass the button to that offender. The student holding the button at the very end of the day received the punishment. But here's the insidious part. They were also forced to name every single person who had held the button before them that day.
So it created a chain of accusation. It incentivized snitching.
Exactly. It turned children into, in Ngũgĩ's words, witch hunters against their own peers. It taught them the lucrative value of treachery. Betray your friends, betray your language, to save yourself.
The genius, the terrible genius of it, was making the children police each other, internalize the suppression themselves.
And the result of all this, the punishment, the shame, the curriculum focused entirely on Europe, was that the language and literature they consumed systematically took them further and further from ourselves to other selves, from our world to other worlds.
Leading perfectly into Ngũgĩ's theory about the dual nature of language. How does he break that down?
He argues that language functions in 2 crucial intertwined ways, as language as communication and language as culture.
Okay, let's take the communication aspect first.
Language as communication involves, he says, 3 aspects. First, there's the language of real life, the words and signs people use when they cooperate, when they work together in the labor process to produce necessities.
Like farming, building.
Exactly. Second, there's speech, the everyday verbal signals, the sounds we use to interact. And third, there are the written signs, the literature, the texts. In a healthy society, these 3 are integrated.
Okay, in the second dimension, language as culture.
This is, for Ngũgĩ, perhaps the more profound role. Language as culture is the carrier of a people's collective memory bank. It holds their history, their shared values, moral, ethical, aesthetic. It carries the images of the world passed down through generations.
So culture isn't separate from language. It lives inside the language.
He insists they are inseparable. Culture is generated by the language, it grows within it, and it's transmitted by it. Think of songs, stories, proverbs. They all live in the language.
So in a non-colonized context, the language you use to work and chat every day is the same language that carries your history, your values, your deepest cultural sense of self.
Yes. And the colonial education system, by imposing a foreign language for all important things, schooling, literature, administration, abstract thought, deliberately ruptured this unity.
That rupture.
Yeah.
Is that what he means by colonial alienation?
That's precisely it. The foreign language becomes the language of the mind, of thinking, of education. The child's mother tongue, the language of their home, their emotions, their immediate reality is relegated, devalued.
Creating a split between the language of thinking and the language of being,
Yeah.
of daily life.
A fundamental split. He uses this striking image. It produces a society of bodiless heads and headless bodies. The educated elite operate intellectually in a foreign sphere, detached from the lived reality and culture of the masses.
While the masses are potentially cut off from the tools of intellectual articulation about their own condition, at least in the dominant system.
Exactly. Even reading great European literature, Ngũgĩ argues, couldn't heal this division because the location of this great mirror of imagination was necessarily Europe and its history. It reflected a world alien to the African child's reality.
That point about location is so powerful. The mirror reflects someone else's world, not yours.
And you see the tragic, concrete effects of this alienation in an anecdote he shares about his friend, Professor Messire Mugo.
What happened?
She recalled reading Rider Haggard's novel, King Solomon's Mines, as a child. It contains this racist, grotesque depiction of an old African woman character named Ngũgĩ.
A very stereotypical witch doctor figure, right?
Precisely. The description was so vivid and terrifying that Professor Mugo confessed that for years afterwards, whenever she encountered actual old African women in her community, women who should have represented wisdom and tradition, she felt a deep, almost mortal terror.
Wow. So the literature, the English text, had literally weaponized her perception against her own people, her own elders, making her see them through a hostile foreign lens.
That's the cultural bomb achieving its aim. Complete psychological disorientation and alienation from your own roots.
So this deep systemic injury, this alienation, inevitably shaped the choices facing the first wave of African writers emerging around independence, didn't it?
It absolutely did. They were products of that colonial education system. They inherited this fractured linguistic landscape, and their attempts to navigate it led to what Ngũgĩ later analyzes as the Afro-European detour.
And there was a specific moment, a conference, where this detour was sort of formalized.
Yes, a really pivotal moment was the conference held in Kampala, Uganda in 1962. It was organized by the Department of English at Maker University College.
And the title of the conference?
The title itself is incredibly revealing. It was called A Conference of African Writers of English Expression.
Of English expression.
Exactly. The very framing presupposed that African literature worth discussing was, or perhaps even had to be, written in English. It implicitly accepted the colonial language as the primary vehicle.
Which must have meant some significant writers were excluded from a conference about African literature.
The exclusions were, looking back, absurd. Ngũgĩ himself attended, he was a student then, with only a couple of published short stories. But think about who wasn't eligible under that title.
Like who?
Like Shaban Robert, who was widely considered the greatest living poet in East Africa at the time, but he wrote in Kiswahili. Or Chief Fagunwa, a major Nigerian writer, hugely influential, but he wrote in Yoruba.
So, because they wrote in African languages, they couldn't be part of the defining conversation about African literature.
According to the conference title, no. And the consequence, and Jay argues, was that the whole debate that followed about what is African literature completely sidestepped the fundamental issue.
Which was the domination of imperialist languages.
Right. Instead of asking why English or French should be the default, the discussion got bogged down in secondary questions like, does it have to be about African subject matter? Or does the author have to be Black?
They accepted the linguistic premise, the gift of the colonial language.
They seemed to feel trapped by it. Chinua Achebe, famously, described this feeling later as the fatalistic logic of the unassailable position of English in our literature.
That phrase, fatalistic logic, says so much.
It does. Achebe articulated the dilemma very honestly. He asked, is it right that a man should abandon his mother tongue for someone else's? It looks like a dreadful betrayal and produces a guilty feeling. But then he concluded, but for me, there is no other choice. I have been given the language and I intend to use it.
I have been given the language. It sounds like accepting a tool, even if it feels wrong.
Exactly. And this led to what Ngũgĩ identifies as the compromise position. Writers like Achebe, Gabriel Akara, Wole Soyinka, to some extent incredibly talented writers, decided they would take English and, well, bend it.
Africanize it.
Yes, that was the term often used. They aimed to make English carry the weight of our African experience. They did this by infusing it with African proverbs, speech rhythms, syntax, imagery, folklore, forging a new English.
And undeniably, they created powerful, groundbreaking literature that put African writing on the world map. Things Fall Apart, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. The literary achievement is immense and undeniable. But Njaga's critique cuts deeper. He asks, Despite the artistic success, was this strategy ultimately successful in terms of cultural liberation? Did it truly decolonize the mind?
What's his assessment?
He argues that while brilliant, the effort was ultimately misdirected. Think about what was happening practically. These writers were taking the cultural treasures of Africa, its proverbs, its rhythms, its unique ways of seeing the world, and using them to enrich foreign languages, English, French, Portuguese.
So they were decorating the colonizers' linguistic house with ornaments taken from their own heritage.
But that's a good way to put it. Ngũgĩ sees it as an act of perhaps unintentional linguistic charity towards the languages of empire.
And he poses the alternative.
The alternative would have been to focus on enriching African languages themselves.
Hmm.
Why not translate the great democratic, humanist, revolutionary works of world literature, Tolstoy, Brecht, Shakespeare, Marx, Fanon, into Gikuyu, into Yoruba, into Wolof?
That would have asserted the capacity of African languages to carry world knowledge rather than using African knowledge to bolster European languages.
Precisely. That would have been an act of cultural sovereignty, building the capacity of the mother tongues.
So Ngũgĩ's final verdict on this body of work, this compromise,
He defines it as Afro-European literature, or sometimes Euro-African literature. He sees it as a hybrid tradition, important but ultimately a minority tradition. It was produced mainly by the Western-educated petty bourgeoisie for an audience largely like themselves.
and tied to the political context.
Yes, he's quite blunt about it. He says this literature is historically bound to last only for as long as Africa is under this rule of European capital in a neo-colonial setup. He felt it wore false robes of identity because it wasn't rooted in the languages of the majority, the peasants and workers who, for him, were the true carriers of national culture and memory.
So a necessary step perhaps, but one that didn't reach the core of the linguistic colonization issue.
A detour, in his analysis, a brilliant detour, but a detour nonetheless from the path of full linguistic and cultural reclamation.
Okay, so political independence arrives, but the linguistic and cultural struggle continues. The first generation of writers working in European languages created this Afro-European tradition. How did Ngũgĩ move from analyzing this theoretically to making a radical break in his own practice?
This is where the story takes a really dramatic turn, moving from the university seminar room out into the community. It was triggered by a very direct, personal encounter.
What happened?
Ngũgĩ was established by then, a successful novelist writing in English, working at the University of Nairobi. But in 1976, a woman from Kamirithu village, which is near Limuru where he grew up, approached him.
And she said,
She essentially challenged him. She said something like, "We hear you have a lot of education and write books. Why don't you and others like you give some of that education back to the village?"
wow, a direct call for relevance. A demand to bridge that gap between the bodiless heads and the headless bodies he described.
It was exactly that. He describes it as a pivotal moment, forcing him out of the relative comfort of the academic world and into direct dialogue with the peasant and worker class.
And this led to a fundamental shift in his approach.
It led to what he calls an epistemological break. A realization dawned on him. The question of audience determines the question of language, which in turn determines the question of audience. It's circular.
Meaning, if you want to speak to the masses,
You have to speak in the language of the masses. English, the language of his previous novels, was simply irrelevant to the majority of people in Kamirithu. So he made a decisive choice.
to write in Gikuyu.
Yes. He decided his next major creative project, a play, would be written collaboratively with Thiong'o Amiria, and it would be written directly in Gikuyu. The play became Gahika Indinda, which translates as I will marry when I want.
And the content presumably reflected this shift towards the concerns of the villagers.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't some nostalgic piece about traditional village life. It was a powerful, fiercely anti-colonial critique. It tackled the issue of how the peasantry was being turned into a landless, working-class proletarianization.
And it directly addressed the post-independence reality.
Critically so. It depicted what Ngũgĩ calls the monumental betrayal of independence by the new Kenyan elite, the comprador class, who were seen as serving foreign interests rather than the people. Using Gikuyu allowed for a direct critique of this local elite in the language the people understood intimately.
And the form of the play also changed. It wasn't just a translation of a Western play structure.
Not at all. This was key. They consciously reconnected with Kenyan and African performance traditions. Unlike a lot of Western theater, where songs or dances might feel like interruptions or decorations, here they were, integral, structural.
How so?
For example, there's a long sequence in the play where the history of the struggle against colonialism, including the Mau Mau War, is remembered and reenacted entirely through song and dance. It flows naturally from the dialogue about the past. It is the memory.
And because it was in Geikyu, the villagers weren't just a passive audience watching something foreign.
Exactly. They became active participants, collaborators, and, in a sense, the ultimate authorities on the play's authenticity. This is the Khmer experiment.
How did that collaboration work in practice?
It was incredibly democratic and open. They held open auditions, rehearsals were conducted in the open air, and the script itself was subject to intense debate and revision by the community members.
So the peasants and workers were literally shaping the final work.
Yes. Ngũgĩ tells these wonderful stories about how the villagers would challenge him and Ngege Wamirie on points of linguistic accuracy and dignity. They'd say, no, an elder wouldn't speak like that. To show respect, he must use this particular proverb. They were the guardians of the language and its nuances.
That completely demystifies the artistic process, doesn't it? It challenges the idea of the lone genius creator.
It totally does. Ngige rejects the model that produces active stars and an undifferentiated mass of grateful admirers. This was collective creation. He lovingly refers to the participants as holding PhDs from the University of the Factory in the plantation.
That's a great phrase. Any specific examples of that expertise?
One amazing detail he shares is that they needed imitation guns for the play's historical sequences. They found a man in the village who had actually been a gunmaker for the Mau Mau fighters during the Independence War. He used his old skills to craft the props.
Incredible. Bringing history directly onto the stage through the skills of the community. This whole project sounds intensely political. It must have attracted attention from the authorities.
It was like a cultural explosion. The play was a massive, unprecedented success. People came from all over, sometimes hiring whole buses to get to Khmer Rouge. Tens of thousands saw it. Its songs, its phrases, its characters entered everyday conversation as ways of talking about corruption, inequality, the anti-people tendencies of the elite.
The government couldn't have liked that. A popular, critical voice emerging in the people's own language.
They absolutely could not tolerate it. The neo-colonial state, feeling threatened by this expression of popular consciousness, reacted with force.
What did they do?
First, the district commissioner withdrew the play's license, shutting down performances after only a few weeks. But the community continued to use the open-air theater space they had built for other meetings and cultural activities.
So state escalated.
Drastically. In a truly shocking act of cultural vandalism, on March 12, 1982, the government sent 3 truckloads of heavily armed police to Khmer Rouge. Their mission? To raze the open-air theater to the ground. They physically demolished the stage, the earthen seats, everything the community had built with their own hands and resources.
Destroying the physical structure, trying to erase the memory, the possibility.
But as often happens with such acts of repression, Ngige argues the destruction backfired. By trying to physically eliminate the theater, the regime actually ensured the immortality of the Khmer Rouge idea.
How so?
It proved just how powerful, how dangerous the state considered this experiment in self-reliant democratic culture expressed in an African language. They feared a simple wooden stage built by peasants more than perhaps an armed uprising. It solidified the vision.
The vision of a truly independent Kenya, expressed in its own terms.
Yes. The authentic language of African theater, Ngige concluded from this, wasn't about linguistic purity in the abstract. It was to be found in the heart of the people's struggles for liberation. The state's reaction wasn't just against the theater, of course. The political price for Ngige personally was immediate. Following the success and suppression of Ngahika and Dinda, he was arrested without trial in late 1977.
Then imprisoned.
Yes, detained under the Public Security Act and sent to Committee Maximum Security Prison. His new room of one's own, as he wryly puts it, became Cell 16, a tiny concrete isolation cell.
The goal, presumably, was to isolate him, break his connection with the people he'd just energized, silence him.
That was undoubtedly the intention. But paradoxically, the isolation seems to have solidified his resolve. It was in prison that he made the decision to fully commit to writing fiction in Geikyu, continuing the path started with the play.
And this led to his first novel written entirely in Geikyu.
Exactly, Kaitani Mutharabani, which translates to Devil on the Cross, written right there in Committee Prison.
Now, there's a famous, almost legendary detail about how he wrote it, given the conditions. Can you remind us?
It's incredible, really. He wasn't allowed sufficient writing paper, so in an act of sheer defiance and resourcefulness, he wrote the entire first draft of the novel on the only paper consistently available to him.
Which was?
Toilet paper. Prison-issued toilet paper. He had to write in tiny script, often in poor light, using salvaged razor blades to hold the fragile sheets together.
Writing a major novel on toilet paper. It's such a powerful symbol, isn't it? Creating literature on the material the state literally designates as waste, the ultimate act of reclamation.
It truly is. But beyond the sheer physical difficulty, there were significant technical challenges in writing a novel in Gikuyu at that time.
Such as,
Well, the existing Gikyu orthography, the standardized way of writing it, had limitations. For instance, it didn't consistently distinguish between long and short vowels, which can change the meaning of words. And being a tonal language, it lacked standardized tone markings, so context became absolutely crucial to avoid ambiguity. He had to navigate that very carefully.
and stylistically.
Yeah.
He couldn't just replicate the techniques of his earlier English novels, like A Grain of Wheat, which were quite complex, influenced by modernism.
No, he felt he needed a different approach. His intended audience now was the workers and peasants of Kenya, the audience he'd connected with at Kamirifu. He wanted a fiction language that was accessible, engaging, rooted in their traditions, but without being simplistic or condescending.
So what kind of structure did he choose?
He went for a very classic, almost universal narrative structure, the
Hmm.
journey. The protagonist, Waringa, undertakes two main journeys across Kenya, which allows for descriptions of the land and encounters with various characters.
And he combined this with elements from oral storytelling.
Yes, very deliberately. He incorporated techniques familiar from Geikyu oral traditions, like the story within a story, where characters pause the main narrative to tell their own tales. He used proverbs, songs, even sections of poetic self-praise, like traditional heroic recitations. It was designed to feel familiar, like listening to a skilled storyteller.
And this accessible form carried a very pointed message, didn't it? The title, Devil on the Cross, is already provocative.
Extremely pointed. He used the theme of the Faustian Pact, selling your soul to the devil, as a central metaphor to critique the Kenyan neo-colonial elite, the comprador bourgeoisie.
Those who had sold out the ideals of independence for personal gain.
Precisely, and he blended this with figures from Geikyu folklore, specifically the Marame Pofer. These are man-eating ogres, often depicted as having two mouths, symbolizing their duplicity and insatiable greed. He used these grotesque figures to represent the elite.
Why the grotesque? Why push into that territory?
He felt the reality of neo-colonial Kenya under the Moi dictatorship was already so absurd, so grotesque, that realism alone couldn't capture it. How do you satirize a reality where the president demands everyone sing like parrots in praise of him? You have to amplify it, push it into satire, into the allegorical and the grotesque to expose its true nature.
Which brings us to probably the most famous section of the novel, the thieves' competition.
Yes, the International Organization of Thieves and Robbers holds a feast in a cave in Ilmarog, the novel's fictional setting. The highlight is a competition to crown the 7 cleverest modern thieves and robbers in the country.
And they boast about their exploits.
They boast about how they steal from the people through corruption, land grabbing, exploitative businesses. It's a scathing, satirical portrait of the ruling class. But then one competitor takes it to a whole new level.
The one obsessed with immortality.
Exactly. He's amassed huge wealth, but he's tormented by the fact that he, like the poor he exploits, will eventually die. He wants to transcend mortality.
And his grand plan is...
Chillingly capitalist, as you said earlier. He envisions building a high-tech factory entirely dedicated to mass-producing human spare parts. Hearts, kidneys, limbs, so the rich can buy replacements and achieve a kind of functional immortality.
leaving death solely for the poor.
Leaving death for the poor. And then comes that unforgettable grotesque detail. In his vision of ultimate luxury and status for the super rich, he suggests the factory should also produce
Extra penises.
extra penises as a mark of ultimate wealth and power. It's so absurd, so obscene, it perfectly captures the insatiable, unnatural greed he's satirizing.
It's a detail that sticks with you. But it's a serious critique of class and the commodification of literally everything, including life itself.
Absolutely. It's taking the logic of capitalism. If you have enough money, you can buy anything to its most horrifying, extreme conclusion. And it doesn't stop there.
His wife objects.
Well, she doesn't object to the plan itself. She immediately demands that if they're making spare parts, the factory must also produce 2 female organs for every woman of her class for equality in immortality and excess.
Leading to an argument about spare body parts.
Yes. A furious, class-inflected argument breaks out about who deserves multiples of which organs, beautifully illustrating the complete moral and spiritual bankruptcy Ngũgĩ saw in this class.
Okay, so it's a deeply critical, satirical, even grotesque novel. How was it received when it was eventually published after Ngũgĩ's release? Remember, it was in Geikyu.
The reception was astonishing, completely unprecedented for a novel published in an African language in Kenya. It became a phenomenon.
In what way?
It proved there was a huge, untapped audience hungry for literature in their own language. People read it collectively. It was read aloud in families, on buses during commutes. Workers read sections to each other during lunch breaks.
And this led to the emergence of something quite unique.
Yes, the phenomenon of the professional readers in bars and public spaces. Someone who owned a copy, or had access to one, would read the novel aloud to groups of people who couldn't afford the book, or perhaps weren't fully literate.
And the listeners would keep them supplied with
Beer. The reader would read until their glass was empty, then pause. The captivated audience would quickly buy them another drink so the story could continue. It became this organic, communal, grassroots form of literary distribution.
That's incredible. It completely bypasses the formal structures of publishing and distribution, fueled entirely by popular demand for the story in their language.
It was powerful proof for Ngũgĩ of the immense potential. It showed that a genuinely African novel, rooted in the people's languages and experiences, could find a massive audience.
And he saw this as pointing towards a different future for African literature.
Yes. Instead of the Afro-European model, always looking towards London or Paris, he envisioned a future built on translation between African languages. Imagine novels translated from Igbo into Yoruba, from Luo into Swahili, from Gikuyu into Lingala.
Creating a truly interconnected Pan-African literary sensibility, rooted in the continent's own linguistic diversity.
That was the vision, a literature speaking to and between the vast majority of the continent's people in the languages that carry their history and culture.
So Ngũgĩ takes the struggle from the stage at Kimirithou to the prison cell with Devil on the Cross, but the fight also had to happen back where it arguably started, within the university itself, the institution that had been a key site for implanting the cultural bomb.
Exactly. The battle had to be waged on the academic front, too. And this takes us back to an earlier but crucial event, the Great Nairobi Literature Debate of 1968.
This was at the University of Nairobi.
Yes, it was a formal challenge, a direct assault, really, on the existing structure of literary studies, which was dominated by the English department. The fundamental assumption underpinning that department was
that English literature, the English tradition, was the central pillar, the main line of cultural continuity that African students needed to connect with.
Precisely. The assumption was that the historic continuity of a single culture, meaning the English literary tradition from Chaucer onwards, was, or should be, the core of literary consciousness for students in East Africa.
And Ngũgĩ, along with some colleagues, challenged this premise head-on.
Yes. 3 African lecturers, Ngũgĩ himself, Henry Awoor Numba, and Taban Loliang, wrote a proposal, a manifesto almost, calling for the complete abolition of the English department as it was then constituted.
Abolition, that's strong language. Not just reform, but abolition.
It was radical. They rejected the foundational premise that Africa was just a cultural tributary of Europe. Their counter-argument was deceptively simple but revolutionary. If there's a need to study the historic continuity of a single culture, why shouldn't that culture be African culture?
Why couldn't African literature and African cultural history be the center, the starting point?
Exactly. They weren't just asking for a few African books to be added to the syllabus. They were demanding a fundamental philosophical recentering of the entire field of study.
What was the alternative structure they proposed?
They argued for a new organizing principle based on relevance to the student's own reality. The curriculum should start at the center and move outwards concentrically.
So, starting with
Kenya and East Africa, its literature, its history, its culture, then expanding outwards to encompass the rest of Africa. Then outwards again to the Third World, the literatures and cultures of other formerly colonized regions, and only then outwards to the rest of the world, including Europe.
So, Shakespeare or Tolstoy would still be studied, but they'd be viewed in relation to the African experience and context, not as the universal standard against which African culture is measured.
Precisely. It flicks the perspective entirely. And there was another absolutely crucial element to their proposal, something that really struck at the heart of the colonial hierarchy of knowledge.
Otherwise,
Their insistence on placing oral literature, what's often called orature, at the absolute core of the new syllabus.
centering the songs, the stories, the epics, the proverbs of the people.
Yes, this was a profound political statement. By centering orature, they were validating the cultural heritage of the peasantry and workers, the vast majority, as the primary source, the foundation of Kenyan and African literary study. It directly challenged the colonial elevation of the written word, especially the European written word, over the indigenous oral traditions.
This academic debate about syllabuses and departments sounds like it was really reflecting a much bigger political and ideological struggle happening in Kenya and across post-colonial Africa at the time.
Oh, absolutely. Ngũgĩ is very clear about this. The debate wasn't just about books. It mirrored two fundamentally opposed intellectual and political lines contending for the future direction of the nation. These lines, he argues, still exist today in various forms.
Can you outline those two contending lines as he saw them?
On one side, you have what he terms the pro-imperialist line. This perspective is often promoted by the ruling elite, the comprador class, and state intellectuals aligned with them.
And how does this line view history and the future?
It tends to see imperialism not primarily as exploitation, but almost as a necessary engine for development or modernization. It often downplays or even scoffs at the history of popular resistance like Mau Mau, and instead praises collaboration with colonial or neo-colonial powers. Its vision for the future essentially equates progress with deeper integration into and subservience to Western economic and cultural systems.
The sing like parrots mentality, as President Moi put it.
Exactly. It's a perspective that looks outwards for validation and direction.
Okay, and the opposing line.
Ngũgĩ calls this the resistance tradition line. This perspective insists on centering the nation, its history of struggle, and the interests of the majority, the peasants and workers. It emphasizes democracy, self-reliance, and national sovereignty.
And its view of the neo-colonial state.
It sees the neo-colonial state, run by the comprador elite in alliance with foreign capital, as fundamentally an obstacle to genuine progress, the negation of Africa's progress, as Ngũgĩ puts it. This line seeks to connect Kenya's and Africa's struggles with progressive and democratic movements globally, but always from a position of self-determination.
So for anyone studying these issues, for this student or learner you mentioned at the start, the seemingly academic question of what literature should we study or what language should be central is actually deeply political. It forces you to consider where you stand in relation to these larger forces.
It absolutely does. Ngũgĩ argues that a quest for true relevance in education, in culture, in intellectual life cannot be neutral. It requires taking a stand. It must have a philosophical and indeed a class basis that is fundamentally anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and committed to democratic and egalitarian struggle.
You can't just be a detached observer.
Not if you want your knowledge to mean something in the real world.
Oh.
He quotes the playwright Bertolt Brecht to underscore this point. Brecht warns scientists and intellectuals.
What's the quote?
Your science will be valueless unless you pledge your intellect to fighting against all enemies of mankind. It's a call for engaged scholarship, for intellectual work committed to justice. Hashtag tag outro. Final thought.
So we've covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive. We started with the chilling concept of the cultural bomb and that psychological violence Ngũgĩ identified in the colonial classroom.
Moved through the compromises and achievements of that first generation writing in European languages, the Afro-European detour.
Then into the radical break of the Kamirithu experiment,
Mm-hmm.
writing in Gikyu theater with the people, and the subsequent repression.
Followed by the defiant act of writing Devil on the Cross on toilet paper in prison, finding a new mass audience.
And ending with that crucial battle within the university itself, the struggle to decenter Europe and recenter Africa in the study of literature and culture.
And the synthesis Ngũgĩ reaches, the core message that resonates right through decolonizing the mind, is that this whole search for new directions in language, in literature, in culture, it's not just an academic game. It's fundamentally part and parcel of the wider, ongoing struggle against neo-colonialism, against economic exploitation, against mental subjugation.
So when he calls for the resumption of African languages, for centering them.
It's not just about linguistic pride, though that's part of it. It's a call for a regenerative reconnection with the millions of revolutionary tongues across the continent, the languages of the people who are demanding liberation, demanding sovereignty, demanding the right to define themselves and their world.
It's about reclaiming that fundamental human right to name your reality, to build your future, using the cultural and linguistic tools forged by your own history and community.
Exactly. And this brings us to a final thought, something to maybe leave you, the listener, considering. It stems from that agency, that political commitment we saw in Ngũgĩ and Brecht. And Ngũgĩ constantly reminds us that the only truly universal language, at the end of the day, is the language of struggle. Struggle for justice, for dignity, for liberation.
So the question isn't just about analyzing these ideas intellectually.
No. The challenge Ngũgĩ implicitly poses, borrowing from another poet he admired, Otto René Castillo, is, what will we say? What will you say when the ordinary people, the simple men and women of our time and place, eventually rise and ask us, the intellectuals, the students, the learners, what did you do when our world, our cultures, our possibilities were drying out, were being suppressed?
And we really afford to stay neutral, to stay comfortably cocooned within our academic disciplines, treating culture and language simply as objects of study, when the fight for justice, for linguistic rights, for self-determination is still so urgent all around us.
The struggle, Ngũgĩ suggests, begins wherever we are, in the languages we choose to value, the histories we choose to center, the solidarity we choose to express. In struggle, he concludes, lies our history, our language, our culture, and our authentic being.
A powerful place to end. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the vital work of Ngũgĩ Thiong'o and the necessity of decolonizing the mind. We'll see you next time.